Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 6 on memory. Memory is crucial when we look at psychology because much of our experience of the world is based on our memory. And we can look at memories we've had as children, growing up, memories we had from friendships, just memories we had from last week. And to understand how memory works is important in learning why people do what they do, what motivates people, how people experience the world. And in the day-to-day case of people who struggle with memory, people who might have dementia or Alzheimer's, how it affects how they are doing. And another thing with memory, though, it's not always accurate. We may think we know absolutely for sure something that happened when we were 8 years old, only to have a sibling or a parent say, no, that never happened or that didn't happen to you. And then it becomes confusing as to what is really accurate in our memories and what we tend to imagine. So this is a great chapter, and let's get into it. The first type of memory is explicit memory, and this is also known as declarative memory. And this is a memory for specific information. So the term declarative means that these memories reveal specific information. It could be autobiographical or refer to general kinds of knowledge. And there's two types of explicit memories, episodic and semantic. Episodic memories are memories of things that happened to us in the past or that take place in our present. So it's also known as autobiographical memory. Think of when you start a sentence, I remember, and then you finish your memory. That's episodic memory. It's something that you personally remember about your experience. Semantic memory refers to the general knowledge, and semantics concerns meanings. So when you say, I know who the president was in 1980, that's general knowledge that people know, and that's considered semantic memory. Implicit memory is also known as non-declarative memory. And this is memory of how we perform a task. So it's something like riding a bike. When you first start to ride a bike, you really have to focus and concentrate and try to remember all the steps it takes to ride a bike. The same for driving a car. You have to remember to look in your rearview mirror. You have to remember to turn on the ignition, to put on your seatbelt. There's certain things that you have to do in order to make the car function. So the implicit memories is more about things that we do and not by just things that we're remembering or we're stating and sharing with other people. It involves procedures and skills, and it involves cognitive and physical ability, and these are also referred to as procedural or skill memories. What happens with implicit memories is if you do something often enough, then we do not have to think about how to do it. We just automatically do it. Walking, you had to learn how to walk, and it was step by step, trying to figure out how to move your legs and your feet and your balance. Now you do it without any thought to it. So that's another example of implicit memory. Now, priming refers to frequent repetition that results in our memory. So it helps us make automatic associations because the repetition makes it so we don't have to have any conscious effort to access it in our memory. There's also retrospective memory and prospective memory. Retrospective memory is recalling information that we've previously learned. So episodic, semantic, implicit memories all involve things that were previously learned. Prospective memory refers to remembering to do things in the future. So remembering that you have a class on Tuesday, or remembering that you're going to a concert over the weekend. So this is prospective memory. And sometimes this fails if we're under a lot of stress or preoccupied. And when we tell a friend, oh my gosh, I forgot we were going to meet for lunch. Well, that could be because we were distracted or stressed, but that's referring to our prospective memory that we were supposed to have remembered to meet our friend for lunch. When we talk about memory decline in older adults, it takes place with both retrospective and prospective memories. So older adults may not remember events from the past, and they may also not remember to do events in the future. And this is more related to their cognitive processing, the speed at which that they can pull back this information to remember it. Moods and attitudes can also affect our prospective memory. There's a process that we go through when we're receiving information so that it can be remembered. When we receive the information, it must be changed into a form that can be remembered if we're going to be able to put it into our memory. So encoding essentially modifies information so that we can place it in our memory. When we receive information from the outside world, either through our physical, chemical stimuli that activates our senses, the first stage of information processing encodes these stimuli so that we can place them in our memory. So when we encode information, it transforms the information into psychological formats that can be represented mentally. We get an image of it. And so to do that, people commonly use codes. A visual code is remembering things as a picture. An acoustic code is remembering stimuli as a series of sounds. And semantic code is represented in terms of the meaning of what we're trying to encode. The second memory process is called storage. And storage just means maintaining information over time, just as you would store some sweaters maybe for the winter, or store your toys from when you were little. Storing our memories just puts them in a place where we can maintain them over time. And there's different ways of storing information. There's maintenance rehearsal, and that's where we mentally repeat information, just saying it to ourselves. So if somebody gives you their phone number, you might continually repeat the information in our head to try to remember it. Elaborative rehearsal is elaborating or extending the meaning of what we're trying to remember. And this is often done by relating information to something that's already known. So this is commonly done when we're trying to remember somebody's name, and we learn their name, and then we try to associate their name with something that we already know to help us remember the person's name the next time we see that person. The third process in memory is called retrieval. Retrieval of stored information just means locating it and then returning it to consciousness. Now, sometimes this fails when we're trying to remember large amounts of information, or trying to remember information that we didn't perfectly understand. That can make retrieval difficult. So if somebody gives you their name and it's a name that you're not familiar with, or it's a name that you don't really hear clearly, it's going to be difficult to retrieve their name from your storage because you didn't perfectly understand what their name was when you were trying to learn it. So overall, memory is simply the process by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. There are 3 stages of memory that determine whether information is retained, and these include sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory is the first stage of memory, and this is when we encounter a stimulus. So during sensory memory, we only hold our impression briefly. The memory trace that we have lasts for a fraction of a second, so the information we have needs to be transferred into the next stage for us to be able to remember it. They have found that visual memory, for example, starts disappearing within a second. So it's just a really quick process when we're taking in information through our senses before it's moved on to another stage if we are going to remember it. The information in our sensory memory, if we hold on to it long enough, can be transferred into short-term memory, and this is known as working memory. So think about if you meet somebody for the first time. There's only certain things about that person that you can transfer into short-term memory. So you may not remember what that person is wearing. You may not remember certain features on that person's face. Oftentimes, I'll have people ask me, well, what was the person wearing? And I just can't remember because that's not something I successfully transferred to my short-term memory. So the sensory memory, you only take certain cues that you're given and you transfer them successfully to short-term memory in order to remember. When this information is transferred to short-term memory, also the working memory, known as the working memory, the images tend to fade after 10 to 12 seconds if we don't rehearse them and really try to remember them. The serial position effect affects our short-term memory. It affects what we remember. And this is the tendency to remember the first and last items in a series. So if somebody sends you to the grocery store and this person gives you a list of 7 things to remember to get, chances are you're only going to remember the first or second item on the list and maybe that last item on the list. And that could be because the first item you heard is more immediate for you. It's the first thing that you put into your memory, and the last thing you heard is the last thing that you had to worry about putting into memory. And everything in between didn't get as much focus or attention, and so that tends to be forgotten more easily. Chunking is one of the ways we keep things in our short-term memory, and chunking is when we take a series of things and we put them into a group, into a chunk, and that allows it to be kept easier in short-term memory. And so our telephone numbers, for example, are given to us in 7 digits. Well, now with area codes, we have a little bit more, but the average person is comfortable with remembering about 7 numbers at a time. So the 7 numbers of a telephone number are easy for us to remember because we're able to chunk them together. There can be some things that interfere with our ability to maintain things in short-term memory. One of them is the prevention of rehearsal. So if you learn somebody's name and you want to rehearse their name and say it over and over and over, but then somebody else comes up to you and interrupts you and distracts you, then you're not rehearsing the name and you can easily forget it. Also, new information can displace old information. So if you're trying to remember, somebody just gave you a phone number and you're wanting to rehearse it and remember that phone number, but then on the radio you hear a bunch of numbers spouted out to you, that new information can displace the old phone number information that you were trying to remember. The third stage of information processing is long-term memory. And long-term memory can be just thought of as a huge storehouse of information that contains all the names, dates, places, and everything that we've ever put into our long-term memory. Now, sometimes we have a hard time bringing memories from our long-term memory into our short-term memory because we may not have the proper cues to help us remember them. So if you're studying and you tend to study in the library, but then when you go to take your test, you go into a classroom to take your test, well, you may not have the environmental cues that were there when you were learning the information, so it might be harder to pull the information from your long-term memory. Another thing that could keep people from remembering is the unconscious forces of repression. And this falls back onto Freud, who believed that nearly all people had their ideas stored permanently, but because of repression, we're not able to retrieve them from our long-term memory. And repression is controversial on whether or not we truly experience repression, but a lot of people believe that we don't remember some traumatic things from our childhood because of repression. Our long-term memory may also be distorted by schemas. So when we're pulling things from our long-term memory into our short-term memory, our mental representations of the world could distort the accuracy of our memories. Our ability to store information is essentially unlimited. There's really no capacity for our ability to remember. Now, new information may replace old information in short-term memory, but there's no evidence that long-term memories are ever lost. So long-term memories can endure a lifetime. There are ways to improve our memories through the level of processing. Our memories improve when we process our information more deeply. So when we attend to the information, when we're really paying attention to what is going on in the moment, when we're transferring it into long-term memory, when we encode the information successfully, when we relate it to people that we already know, when we're thinking about what's in front of us as we move the memory from short-term to long-term. So essentially, the more we pay attention to information related to things that we already know, really consider what we're thinking about, we are more likely to successfully encode memory from short-term to long-term, so that when it comes time to pull it back from long-term, we are more successful. So in trying to retrieve our memories, there's context and state-dependent memory. Context-dependent memory is what I spoke of earlier, as far as if you're studying for a test and you're studying within a library, it's easier for you to remember the information if you're in another library-like setting when you're trying to remember. So the context in which you learn information helps to retrieve it later on more successfully. State-dependent memory refers to your physiological or emotional state that you were in when you encoded and stored your memory. So if you were really, really happy when you learned something, chances are when you're really happy, you're going to be able to retrieve that memory more easily. Think about when you're sad every sad thing that ever happened to you starts popping up because you're in the same state-dependent memory. You're feeling sad, so everything that ever happened to you that made you sad, you're going to remember more easily. The same for when you're happy. When you're happy, happier memories are easier to bring forth. 3 types of basic memory tasks have been used by psychologists to measure forgetting. And these are recognition, recall, and relearning. Now, in recognition, we're able to recognize something that makes it easier to remember. That's why multiple choice tests are easier, because the answer is there. You just have to recognize what the answer is. Recall occurs when you simply just have to remember the information. So if you have a fill-in-a-blank test, you have to recall your previous learned information in order to answer the question correctly. And this was measured by psychologists through the use of paired associates. Students would read through a list pair by pair, and later they were shown the first member of each pair and asked to recall the second. And so psychologists were able to measure their ability to recall successfully. The third method used for measuring retention is relearning. And this is the belief that people can relearn information more rapidly the second time. So to study relearning, psychologists devised a method called the method of savings. And first, a number of repetitions were recorded, and people were required to learn a list of nonsense syllables or words. And then their repetitions were recorded when they were required to relearn the list after a certain amount of time had relapsed. And so the difference between the number of repetitions determined the savings. So the savings is the difference between the number of repetitions originally required to learn a list and the number of repetitions required to learn the list after a certain amount of time had relapsed. The interference theory looks at why people forget. And according to the interference theory, people forget material in short and long-term memory because newly learned material interferes with it. And there's 2 basic types of interference. There's retroactive interference and proactive interference. Now, in retroactive interference, new learning interferes with the retrieval of old learning. So, for example, a student might memorize the names of the bones in the leg just through repeating and repeating and repeating, but later may find out that learning the names of the bones in the arms makes it more difficult to remember the names of the leg bones. So that's retroactive interference. In proactive interference, older learning interferes with the capacity to retrieve more recently learned material. So think about when you're introducing maybe your girlfriend or your boyfriend to somebody, a new girlfriend or boyfriend, and you can't remember the person's name because your old boyfriend or your old girlfriend's name keeps popping up in your head. That's proactive interference because the older name is interfering with your ability to remember the newer name. Now, I referred to repression a little bit before, and repression is the concept of motivated forgetting. This is automatically ejecting painful memories from conscious awareness, and it could be connected with dissociative amnesia, where there's some type of trauma and we purposely forget or repress that memory. Now, there is controversy right now in psychology about whether or not repression really does exist, and if so, how does it work? And there's also belief that many recovered memories that people have in therapy are sometimes induced by the therapist himself, who tend to lead people into remembering something that may not have really happened. And they've done numerous studies to show how easily it is to implant false memories into people. So this calls into question a lot of the memories people have of traumatic events that happened years before, because then you have to see, did this memory, is it really accurate, or is it a memory that was implanted by somebody else or by another instance of maybe seeing a movie or seeing something occur with somebody else where you start believing this really did occur for me. Infantile amnesia is the inability to recall childhood events. Freud attributed this to purposely repressing our aggressive and perverse impulses that we have when we're young children. But it's probably more the result of just the immaturity of the hippocampus, where that's involved with memory, and the incomplete myelination of the brain pathways for the first few years. So infantile amnesia has more to do with an undeveloped brain than it actually has to do with purposely trying to repress aggressive memories. So we hear about people that struggle with amnesia, and this can result if there's damage to the brain that affects their ability to remember something in short-term memory or something that occurred a while back. And it could be damage to the brain, or it could be a result of trauma. So memory relies on complex neural networks that draw on different brain areas. The hippocampus stores new memories, and it relays sensory information to parts of the cortex. And the sensory cortex areas store sensory information. So if you have any damage to different areas of the brain involved with memory, you might have, or people might experience some type of amnesia. The prefrontal cortex, as we learned in previous chapters, is executive center in memory, and it helps us to represent and be aware of past, present, and future events. The thalamus is involved in the formation of verbal memories, and during learning, new synapses are formed and changes occur at existing synapses.